So with the second part of our lecture, we now turn to developments in other parts of the so-called Islamic heartland, which in many ways really corresponds to the Middle East. And if you're talking about the Middle East in the 19th century, the vast majority of it part of the Ottoman Empire. So that roughly would correspond to what today is the modern state of Turkey, the Turkish Republic, and pretty much all of the so-called Arab states, right, where the majority of the population today would define themselves as Arab, ethnically, linguistically, and so forth. Though, at the beginning of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had control over a large amount of territory in Southeast Europe. And in some ways, that is the crux of the problem. They're very rapidly losing territory there, particularly in the early part of the 19th century. As you can see from the map, they're going to lose control of Bessarabia, what today is Moldova, the orange territories corresponding to modern-day state of what would become Yugoslavia, what today you have Croatia, Serbia, and so forth, territories corresponding to Romania, Greece, and so forth, and then eventually by the end of the century, pretty much losing everything in Southeast Europe. So there is this kind of feeling that the Ottoman Empire is in a state of decline, right? I should note that many historians debate whether, the term decline accurately describes what was going on in the Ottoman Empire during this period, particularly if we're talking about to what extent the Ottoman government is able to consolidate its authority over its territory in Asia, in the Middle East. And, so some would argue it's more appropriate to talk about adaptation. But certainly for many in the Ottoman government coming into the 19th century, there was a feeling that the empire was in a state of decline, certainly militarily. Increasingly losing battles, more often than not being fought with the Russian Empire, certainly in terms of losing territory. So this feeling that, there really was a need for reform. And much as we saw in the case of Egypt, reform is, kind of underlying this idea of reform is that we need to modernize. And for many, modernization means westernization, becoming more like Europe, right? Europe perceived as a growing threat. Not just militarily, but also, in terms of political influence, social influence, and so forth. Definitely in terms of, being able to impose economic terms on the region and so forth, right? So the big debate really was about how to deal with that, and should that, we know we need reform, but does that mean reforming on European lines? Should we be borrowing wholesale from Europe, pretty much rejecting our own culture, becoming more like Europe? Should we just borrow some things from Europe, try to somehow recontextualize them within our own culture, our own society? Or should we reject European influence altogether, right? Should we, try to come up with our own indigenous basis for modernization? Early on, probably the prevailing view is that we definitely need to borrow from Europe, but, maybe we should be very selective, right? Kind of cherry pick those things that we think would be useful, especially, in terms of military reform, making sure we're able to counter Europe as a military threat. Later on, expanding the possibilities in terms of, political reform, economic reform, and so forth. Probably the first real attempt at modernizing the Ottoman Empire along European lines, and at this point really focusing on the military, so in some ways not that different from what we saw with Muhammad Ali in Egypt, would be under the Sultan Selim III, right? So he was Sultan from 1789 to 1807. This is, for the most part, corresponding to developments after the French occupation of Egypt or concurrent with it. So, again, that was having a big impact on how people in the Middle East perceived Europe, and kind of a growing recognition that they posed a threat. And early on, at least in the case of the Ottoman Empire, modernizing efforts are going to be greatly resisted, both by the ulama, the religious scholarly group who, for whom most are fairly conservative, are concerned about European influences undermining, the Islamic basis of Ottoman society. Though to some extent that also had to do with, maintaining their own position within the political and social hierarchy. Another group resistant to reform would be the Janissaries, this elite fighting force that we've already encountered. Modernizing the military along European lines would have meant emphasizing the infantry, and many Janissaries saw that as a threat. And in fact, they were actually correct. Muhammad Ali had basically dealt with a similar concern with respect to the Mamluks, who had constituted kind of the political and military elite before the French occupation. Also resistant to reform, Muhammad Ali had simply had them eliminated. And by eliminated, I mean killed. Selim III isn't going to adopt such an extreme solution, but he might later regret that he hadn't. The Janissaries will eventually rise up and revolt against him and basically have him dethroned and imprisoned. So this first attempt at serious reform in the Ottoman Empire in many ways will fail. The second attempt, however, will be much more successful, will be much broader in scope, what we refer to as the Tanzimat reforms, which will basically run from 1839 until 1878. And there are two sultans that feature prominently in this regard. One is Mahmud II, and so he's going to initiate the Tanzimat reforms right at the end of his reign, and then after him we have Abdülhamid II, who will be sultan for the bulk of the period encompassed by the Tanzimat reforms. By the way, the term Tanzimat, literally Arabic, but then borrowed into Turkish, literally meaning reorganizing, right? So the idea of kind of reorganizing the Ottoman Empire militarily in terms of its political structures, its social hierarchy, definitely in terms of infrastructure, in terms of economic policy, and so forth. So there will be, the Tanzimat are going to be very broad in scope, right? It's a little bit like what, kind of recognizing what Muhammad Ali understood, which is if you want to, it's okay to talk about reforming the military, to make the Ottoman Empire, in this case, stronger to resist European incursions, but kind of recognizing that in order to do that, reforms are going to have to be much more far-reaching, are going to have to deal with political, economic, and social issues and so forth. So the Tanzimat are going to be incredibly broad in scope. We should note the sultans really aren't the driving force for the Tanzimat reforms. There are a series of ministers. I'm not going to run a list of their names, but actually are going to feature much more prominently in promoting the kinds of reforms that the Tanzimat comprise. So the Tanzimat, again, comprising a broad range of reforms in many different areas: political reforms, administrative reforms, developing administrative structures that are a bit more representative of local communities, even eventually a national parliament, having some restrictions on the power of the Sultan. We're going to see educational reforms, the building of schools, development of a curriculum, both for primary and secondary education, a lot of infrastructure, just development of roads, shaping of economic policy, and so forth. There will be some defining principles that they're going to set out early on, probably best represented by two decrees, the Hatti Sharif of Gulhain and the Hatti Humayun. So one very important principle is going to be that of religious equality. In a sense, kind of the transformation of subjects of the empire into citizens, wherein they have equal rights, but also equal obligations to the empire. So in theory, doing away with the millet system, right? Christians will now be considered to be equal citizens, equal Ottoman citizens as their Muslim compatriots. In some ways, this reflects the liberal model of nationalism, related to which they're going to promote a shared national identity known as Ottomanism. And this is, it will to some degree be successful, but it will really run into some pretty serious resistance as well. And there are a number of reasons for this. First of all, This really does represent a radical reconfiguring of the term Ottoman, which until this point really had to do with the ruling dynasty, right? It referred to the House of Osman, maybe to the individuals at the most upper level of government, this kind of idea that they govern in the Ottoman way, but never really as somehow representing the various peoples of the empire. Probably the bigger problem or bigger obstacle is going to be the fact that to the extent that nationalist ideology is influencing how people think of who they are in the empires, it's really reflective more of this romanticist model, right? Wherein what defines your national identity is shared language, shared ethnicity, shared kind of culture, to some degree religion. And so, if people are thinking more nationalistically in the empire, they're more likely, they're not thinking of themselves as Ottomans, but rather as Bulgarians or Greeks or Serbs. And therefore, becoming a basis for wanting to leave the Ottoman Empire, right? Not a basis for feeling a greater level of commitment to it. And in some ways, Ottomanism was actually developed in order to counter this tendency, right? The fact that nationalist ideology was becoming much more pervasive, especially in Southeast Europe, a major factor in why various territories were breaking away, right? Because, they wanted to have their own independent nation state. Something of which, by the way, external forces, in particular Russia, were more than happy to take advantage of. For instance, becoming, militarily involved in the attempt by Bulgarian nationalists to break away from the Ottoman Empire, providing military assistance. Right. So Ottomanism created in a way to counter that. Arguably a bit more successful in the Asian part of the empire, but even there a bit problematic. We're going to find out later when we look at the development of Arab nationalism. But we don't want to say that it didn't work at all. We should be careful to imply that, and we'll kind of see where there are some positive developments related to this. That if it had been possible for these kinds of developments to proceed without interference, perhaps would have taken better root. So at the end of the day, right, the Tanzimat, in addition to infrastructure, education, military reforms, many of which were actually very meaningful. Education, of course, tying into Ottomanism in the sense of promoting this particular form of national identity. Principle of religious equality is a big part of Ottomanism. That it doesn't matter what your religion is, you're equally a citizen of the Ottoman state, equally an Ottoman. And one appeal of that for many non-Muslims, that certain taxes they had to pay were abolished. Probably we should say there is a third obstacle, that while many non-Muslims were more than happy to avail themselves of the new rights they had as equal citizens, many were very reluctant to take on the responsibilities that came along with citizenship, probably chief of which was military service. And that is going to create some tensions between Muslims and non-Muslims. Many Muslims initially having trouble kind of, getting used to the idea of seeing non-Muslims as being on an equal political footing, kind of resenting, the fact that it seemed many were, more interested in taking advantage of their new rights than taking on new responsibilities. Though having said that, we should know, like within a generation, to some degree, Ottomanism was taking root, at least in the Asian part of the empire. Many Muslims were accepting the idea of religious equality. Many Christians were beginning to accept that they had certain obligations and so forth. And, ultimately we should note that a lot of this reflects the commitment of the Tanzimat reformers, many of whom we often refer to as the Young Ottomans. This is actually a pretty typical way of designating individuals at the forefront of nationalist movements, particularly if there's some kind of political reform involved. We talk about the Young Italians, or later on in the Ottoman Empire, the Young Turks, and so forth. Reflects the idea that young people are very often more open to change. In this case, many of the Young Ottomans had been educated in Western universities, so they had a sincere commitment to the kind of reforms they were trying to implement. In connection with Ottomanism, the idea that the government should be more representative of its people, right? So they really believed in constitutional monarchy. They felt, by the way, this would provide the best solution to the empire's growing social unrest, much of it driven by this kind of romanticist nationalism. And again, for many of them, the main problem was these nationalist movements that were beginning to take shape among the various peoples that made up the empire. And to some degree, they did enjoy some success. By 1876, they even had a parliament and a new constitution. The first Ottoman parliament meeting in 1876, after elections which, to all indications, went very smoothly. The first delegates meeting at the first session of the Ottoman Parliament, all indications that they understood that they were there as Ottoman citizens, that they were there to think about what was in the best interest of the empire as a whole, as opposed to representing, kind of the more narrow interests of whatever ethnic group or religious group they came from. So there were indications that, this might somehow succeed. But at the end of the day, this new parliament, constitution, Ottomanism, none of it is really going to be given a chance. The same year that the parliament met for the first time, we will have a new sultan take the throne, Abdülhamid II, 1876. And 2 years later, in 1878, he will suspend the newly created constitution and the parliament and rule autocratically from that point forward. There will still be some reform, but, of a more having to do with infrastructure, maybe, expanding schools a bit more, still promoting Ottomanism, but in this case, is kind of more about loyalty to the Sultan. Will actually emphasize Islam as a basis of that loyalty to a much greater extent. In part, this reflects the fact that most of the European parts of the empire had been lost by this point, so the vast majority of Ottoman subjects/citizens are in fact Muslim. Having said that, maybe one measure of the success of the Tanzimat is that there are still many who believe in the cause of reform, and that will actually lead to the development of a political movement known as the Committee of Union and Progress, which will eventually force Abdülhamid to come down from the throne. He will be deposed in 1909, and again, in large measure, because of this movement that desires to pick up the cause of reform from where it left off. But that is a story for another time. At this point, we move to Iran. The Safavid dynasty is no longer governing there. We have a new dynasty, the Qajar dynasty. And, it's pretty much a familiar story at this point. They are confronted with the same problems that were confronting Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, right? Kind of a recognition that Europe is posing a threat. Not just militarily, though in some ways they're feeling it a great deal more than the Ottoman Empire, but also socially, politically, ideologically, and so forth, that some degree of reform is necessary. There are many, particularly early on, who feel reform, in the sense of modernization, primarily about westernization, imitating Europe. And again, the same debate about, to what extent do we want to borrow from Europe? Now, I indicated in some ways they're feeling the threat of Europe more directly than the Ottoman Empire. To be clear, Iran will never be colonized, but they are getting the squeeze from two empires, two rapidly expanding empires, one to the north, the Russian Empire, which during the preceding period had been expanding into Central Asia, which, back in the day had either been directly ruled by Iran or at least falling within its sphere of influence. So they're getting squeezed from the north by the Russian Empire. And in the south, you have a rapidly expanding British Empire in India that is pushing northward. And, in many ways more concerned about the Russian Empire, but Iran getting caught in the middle. And for the most part, able to fend both off, but it does become pretty dicey by the end of the 19th century. At one point, this is the danger of, for the most part, the Iranian government trying to play the Russian Empire off the British Empire, neither, of course, wanting to see the other become too dominant. The problem is when they begin negotiating a modus vivendi between themselves, what you end up with in one case is Iran being divided into three zones, right? You have a zone of Russian influence in the north, a zone of British influence in the south, and a neutral zone in the middle, the only place where to some degree Iran is truly independent. But you kind of get the gist of it, right? I mean, that they really feel in a very direct way the threat posed by the European powers. And probably the first individual to really promote meaningful reform is going to be Nasser-e-Din Shah, who rules Persia or Iran from 1848 to 1896. So during his reign, you will see some advances made in terms of introducing Western science, technology, also kind of Western educational methods and so forth. In the meantime, just trying to play Great Britain off Russia, Russia off Great Britain, trying to preserve Iran's independence. What's interesting is during this period, you're also going to start seeing the beginnings of a kind of Iranian nationalist sentiment. And in large measure, this probably one major factor is, the fact that they are being squeezed between two foreign powers, right? There's nothing like a them to help generate a clearer sense of who the us is, right? In this case, the them is very visibly present. And so what happens where you really see the first indication of how potent this kind of growing sense of nationalist sensibility, some of this also reflecting the fact that Iran's history had from a pretty early point diverged from that of the rest of the Middle East, right? So it's already going back some ways that Iranians have a strong sense of who they are as something apart from their neighbors. Right, but a really good indication of, maybe the role played by European powers as kind of a catalyst for this is going to be the tobacco protests of 1891. So what happened in this case, at some point, because of British pressure, in 1890, Shah Nasser-ad-Din granted a tobacco concession to a British company, basically giving them exclusive rights to produce, sell, and export all of Iran's tobacco crop in exchange for a loan, right? The loan for the purpose of implementing certain reforms. Now, tobacco mattered economically in Iran at this point. It was a thriving domestic industry, and there were many people who felt threatened by the Shah's actions, given that the tobacco industry employed over 200,000 people. So what resulted was mass protests against the concession, much of which was organized by the Shia ulama, but all indications is that a major kind of motivating factor was Iranian nationalism, right? A sense that, we constitute a nation and we are under threat by foreign powers, right? So they had, for instance, the Shia ulama had issued a fatwa against the use of tobacco. But the reason it resonated with so many people is because this really felt like a genuine nationalist concern, right? The basis of a nationalist cause. And the tobacco merchants, in a show of solidarity, would respond by shutting down the main bazaars, right? Even at the cost of their own profit. And this happened throughout the country. And eventually the Shah was forced to repeal the concession. And to really understand the nationalist nature of this opposition, it's kind of helpful to consider what many historians consider to be the three primary social groups involved, right? On the one hand, you had the ulama, but primarily represented by young theological students. So individuals who, themselves were being influenced by nationalist ideology. But then you also had the bazaar merchants, who we already mentioned. They were kind of the traditional merchant elite in Iran. But again, these are individuals who usually, not to say that their commitment to their Shia faith wasn't genuine, but probably would normally put profit before any kind of, getting involved in any kind of religiously motivated movement, right? And then finally, you have the urban middle class. And these are definitely individuals who, not motivated by religious sentiment, more educated in kind of nationalist ideology, would certainly have been familiar with it. We're talking about professionals, technocrats, but also a large number of students. So they're going to feature very prominently in the protests as well. And it is interesting to consider that it proved successful, maybe a harbinger of the Iranian Revolution that will take place in 1979. In any event, at this point, I want to look specifically at one nationalistic development in the Ottoman Empire, and that is the growth of Arab nationalism, beginning with developments during the middle of the 19th century, right? So, first of all, just to start with, if you went back to the very beginning of the 19th century, around, shortly after the French occupation of Egypt, the term Arab referred to someone who was Bedouin. If you called someone an Arab, you meant they were Bedouin. You would not refer to an Arabic-speaking Muslim from a town as an Arab. This is not how people identified themselves early on. At the beginning of the 19th century, most Arabic-speaking inhabitants of the Ottoman Empire, if you ask them who they are, in the sense of what their communal identity is, they would have identified themselves first and foremost probably on the basis of their religion, right? Most would have said that they were Muslim, which in a way meant they were part of the political mainstream in the Ottoman Empire, probably also reflected a certain devotion to the Ottoman Sultan and so forth. They might have referred to themselves based on what city they came from, if it was an important city. If from Damascus, they might have said, I'm a Damascene. To some degree, tribal and clan affiliation still mattered, though that will be increasingly not the case over the course of the 19th century. So, if you belong to the clan of Muhammad, you would probably proudly declare that you're a Hashemite. The one thing you probably wouldn't have said is that you are an Arab. Right. So, by the way, if you're reading, for instance, a primary source, it could even be in English, written by a missionary active in the Middle East at the early part of the 19th century, if you see the term Arab cropping up a lot, they are not referring to the Arabs in any kind of nationalistic sense. They are probably talking about Bedouin. And for the most part, at the beginning of the 19th century, the vast majority of Arabs, here meaning Arabic-speaking individuals, people who later on we will refer to nationalistically as Arab, were quite happy with the Ottoman government, with Ottoman rule. It wasn't particularly, it hadn't been for a long time, really since the fall of the Caliphate in 1258, if not even going back further, hadn't mattered whether the ruler was Arab or not Arab, as long as they were Muslim and upheld Sharia, Islamic law, but meant in the broadest sense, right? Just kind of in principle, so I just want to be careful there because there are many misconceptions about what Sharia means. So coming back to our map of the Ottoman Empire, if we're talking about the Arabs, we mean, primarily, nationalistically speaking, we mean primarily those individuals residing in the Asian parts of the Ottoman Empire that are not part of what will become Turkey. Those individuals we might refer to as Turks, though, again, we need to be a bit careful. Just as Arabic-speaking people wouldn't have defined themselves communally as Arab, Turkish-speaking people in what today is Turkey would not have defined themselves nationalistically as Turkish at the beginning of the 19th century. In both cases, really the vast majority are loyal Ottoman subjects. And, with respect to the Arabs, even we're not entirely happy with quote-unquote Turkish rule, in the sense that the Ottoman dynasty, probably the larger proportion of those working in the government at the highest level are Turkish. They might occasionally have an issue with, something related to that fact, but really nothing that would make them want to break away from the Ottoman Empire. Most were loyal subjects. And in fact, to some degree, the more we see European influence in the region, colonial influence, imperial influence, right, a growing concern that the European powers might eventually take over the Ottoman Empire, divide it up between them. Probably even the stronger the commitment to the Ottoman Empire, very often seen as the best hope for the Islamic world to resist Western domination, right? The idea that anything you might do to undermine the Ottoman Empire would ultimately do grave harm to Islam and the Islamic world. Now, having said that, we should note that even if we are talking about the Asian part of the empire, the Arabic-speaking parts of the empire, The vast majority of individuals are Muslim, but you do have large numbers of Christians in the Ottoman Empire. If we were to count Egypt, which, remember, up until pretty much up until the First World War, considered nominally a part of the Ottoman Empire, Christians in the empire as a whole made up about a quarter of the Arabic-speaking population. They did tend to be concentrated in certain areas. You have large numbers, particularly in what roughly corresponds to present-day Lebanon and Israel/Palestine, to use a neutral term there. One very important group will be Maronite Christians, which were pretty much, and even until today still are, concentrated in the area known as Mount Lebanon, roughly in the center of the present-day state of Lebanon. So as we mentioned, one aspect of the Tanzimat reforms that was enunciated right from the start with these decrees that we considered, the principle of religious equality, but not everyone was happy with that, including many Christians. Now, a lot of this had to do with the fact that, so supposedly they were being, given, kind of equal rights. They were political equals now of Muslims. And so certainly Christians were happy about that, but there were also obligations that came with being on an equal political footing, and probably most important in that regard would be military service. And many Christians would in fact continue to find ways of getting out of that. And that would be a source of resentment among many Muslims who initially, did have difficulties kind of adjusting to the idea that Christians were somehow politically their equal. To be clear, within a generation, most had kind of acclimated themselves to that. But this would be a bit of an issue early on. And the simple fact is there were just many Christians who preferred millet status, right? Again, a primary reason for that, they hadn't been obligated to do military service. So this is something everyone wanted to avoid. I mean, military service in the Ottoman Empire at this time, you're in the army for the next 20 years, and usually posted very far from home. But as you might imagine, given that many Christians continued to find ways of getting out of that, that would obviously be a source of resentment for those Muslims who weren't able to avoid military service. Now, we also talked about the growing pervasiveness of nationalism, and in some ways that is more evident in the European part of the Ottoman Empire. Initially, particularly during the first few decades of the 19th century, but eventually it's going to take root in the Asian part. And really right now I want to focus on the beginnings of Arab nationalism. And sometimes when historians talk about the development of Arab nationalist ideology, kind of, different ways of conceiving of what would make someone Arab in a nationalistic sense, we often make a distinction between Christians and Muslims in the sense that we're seeing two different kind of ideological developments. And that is a bit of a simplification. But we'll get to that in a moment, right? So first of all, probably the first indication of nationalist thought is going to be among Christian Arabs who were educated in Western missionary schools, right, where many of them end up being exposed to Western nationalist ideology. And why I said it's a bit of a simplification to make this stark division between Christians and Muslims, you will have a fair number of Muslims who are going to end up attending Christian missionary schools, partly because, if their parents, for instance, really desired that they should have a kind of Western-style education, a kind of more European-type curriculum, this would be one way to do it. Many missionary schools are going to be very careful not to, too actively promote the faith, partly because, they're quite happy to attract non-Muslims, hoping that maybe somewhere along the way they might end up being converted. But in any event, we're going to find missionaries especially active in founding missionary schools in Syria, inclusive of Palestine. I hadn't mentioned that, during much of the 19th century, Palestine, even though in many ways a distinct region, very often seen as kind of the southern part of Syria, and it would have included what today is Jordan. But in any event, right, so you're going to have a lot of missionaries that are going to be initiating missionary schools. Probably the most prevalent are going to be Catholic missionary schools, many of them specifically directed at the Maronite Christian population in Lebanon, which, while in many ways a distinct sect, had at this point recognized the authority of the Pope for quite some time. But you're going to have also what we might call Latin Catholic missionary schools, which conform more to Roman Catholicism. Usually the language of instruction will be French. Probably the larger number of these, in fact, founded by French missionaries, Catholic missionaries. And related to this, while they will, students will be learning about kind of nationalist ideology, really, whatever they're learning is going to cause them to affiliate to some degree with France, right? I mean, they begin to associate with the French language as somehow indicating that they've achieved a kind of higher civilizational status, identifying with France and so forth. More important with respect to Arab nationalism are going to be Protestant missionaries, right? I should mention, too, there are also a fair number of Russian Orthodox missionary schools that are started. Those don't really prove to be that popular, even with Christians who are Orthodox, for a number of reasons. One might be that, if you go to a Latin Catholic missionary school, you might one day go abroad to Paris to study. If you go to an Orthodox one, you're probably, your best hope would be going to Moscow, which doesn't quite have the same appeal in the 19th century. But in any event, that's a bit of an aside. Protestant missionary schools probably playing a much more important role with the development of Arab nationalism. And that is primarily because the language of instruction in Protestant missionary schools is going to be Arabic, right? In the French missionary schools, it's French. In the Orthodox missionary schools, it's going to be Russian. Protestant missionaries are going to begin translating textbooks and other curricular material into the Arabic language. That also means that in some ways the Arabic language is going to have to evolve in order to address the various topics that are being covered, with respect to instruction and so forth. As with their counterparts, with the Catholic missionary school and so forth, they're not putting too much emphasis on Protestantism, again in the hopes of attracting in this case, not necessarily Muslim students, but it could be Christian students coming from other sects of Christianity, remembering that the vast majority of Christians in the Ottoman Empire at this point are Orthodox Christians. But in any event, right, students who attend Protestant missionary schools become extremely proficient in the Arabic language, and to the extent that they're also being exposed to nationalist ideology, they really develop a very strong sense of identity in connection with the Arabic language. Many of these Christian Arabs are going to end up becoming part of an Arabic literary revival, right, where they're very active in translating books from foreign languages, from European languages into Arabic, but also developing just kind of a strong appreciation for the beauty of the language, for kind of developing its its sophistication in terms of dealing with different topics related to Enlightenment thought, scientific advancements, and so forth. And all of this is going to connect to a growing sense of nationalist consciousness. And probably most important in this regard will be the Syrian Protestant College, right? So you have many missionary schools that are more about primary education, but you will see the founding of a number of secondary educational institutions, and probably none more prominent than the Syrian Protestant College, which, by the way, is still with us today, currently the American University of Beirut. And probably the first Arab nationalist party is actually going to be founded by 5 Christian graduates of that college around 1875. Now, some historians, when they kind of look at what these guys were actually promoting, they're kind of like, well, I mean, is it really Arab nationalism, or is it more, kind of more narrowly defined Syrian nationalism? A good question might be, does it matter? Right? Because basically they're promoting some kind of nationalism rooted in the Arabic language, right? Basically promoting the idea that it should be inclusive of Muslims and non-Muslims, that they have a shared nationalist identity on the basis of their shared language, the Arabic language, but also kind of their shared history, shared culture, and so forth. So even if really, what they were promoting was Syrian nationalism, it's still the same basic, kind of foundation for a sense of nationalist identity, and certainly would be very easily transferable to, kind of a more broadly defined Arab national identity. So they will have some Muslim Arabs will find this appealing and will become part of this nationalist party that they formed. Mostly they just kind of get together and they kind of talk about different topics related to kind of the scientific advancements of the day, or issues concerning political reform and so forth. The vast majority of Muslims, though, in fact, at this point, still identifying themselves primarily on the basis of their faith. And the fact of the matter is that, this kind of secular model of Arab nationalism that is beginning to develop, right, where, what defines Arab national identity, again, shared language, shared history, shared culture, not so much religion, right? I mean, there would be a recognition of Islam as, a very important contribution of the Arab people, civilizationally speaking, but it isn't the thing that defines who the Arabs are as a people. And this model of Arab nationalism is going to have limited appeal. I should note, even limited appeal among most Christians at this point, right? Religion is still probably the most important marker of communal identity. But in any event, what we're going to see happening alongside of this, the development of this secular model of Arab nationalism, is the development of what we might call a Muslim strain. And that one will end up having, in some ways, a much broader appeal, partly because it doesn't really entail, kind of a dramatic transformation in how you identify yourself from being, first and foremost Muslim to then being first and foremost Arab. But if your sense of what it means to be an Arab is somehow tied to Islam. Though I should note, some of the reasons why any kind of Arab nationalism is going to start having an appeal is because of developments related to the Ottoman government, which is now beginning to promote a kind of centralization of authority, related to which they're really going to start promoting the Turkish language as a basis for both administration and education. Now, and up until this point, the Ottoman Empire, in some ways, the government highly decentralized, right? So, for instance, if you were an Ottoman government official in Damascus, in Syria, to some extent, you did things the Syrian way. There wasn't too much concern about, that you were being consistent with how things were done in the center. Certainly, you would have used Arabic as the primary language of administration, in terms of documents, in terms of, whatever kinds of interactions take place within the administration. To some degree, up until now, the Arab lands were pretty semi-autonomous. So now the Ottoman government is, first of all, trying to really, insist that how we do things in the center is how things should be done throughout the empire, right? We want to have the same basic administrative structure everywhere. And part of that means that everything should be done in Turkish. So first of all, political careers are going to be affected by this, right? Many Arabs, operating in the Ottoman administration in Damascus, in Jerusalem, in Palestine, in what will become Iraq, and so forth, don't speak Turkish, or not proficiently. I should note also we're talking about Ottoman Turkish, which is something quite different from what you have in the Turkish Republic today, and in many ways much more difficult, right? So, first of all, that's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, and there's also just kind of a resentment of the center imposing its will on the provinces. Now, the Ottoman government is also promoting Turkish as that it should be the language of education, right? And we're starting to see the proliferation of Ottoman educational institutions and kind of an insistence that, regardless of what part of the empire we're talking about, the language of instruction must be Turkish. So first of all, again, that would preclude many Arabs from actually getting a job working within an educational institution. But, there's also a sense of pride, right? That the Arabic language is, in a sense, being marginalized. And Arabs, at the same time that they're really beginning to take an even greater sense of pride in the Arabic language, they're now being told that it has no place in the Ottoman Empire. And many of these reforms are also very secular, that are being promoted by, in connection with the Tanzimat. So already, if you're more conservative-minded, you're not too happy with that. And then certainly the diminishing of the importance of the Arabic language might be seen as also diminishing the importance of Islam, given that Arabic is the language of the Quran. And then finally, many Christians also not happy about this. In some parts of the empire, particularly Lebanon, Christians had achieved a certain degree of autonomy. So they're not happy about, kind of this consolidation of authority in the center, right? Which basically would eliminate, at least to some extent, their semi-autonomous status. So a lot of this is actually going to enhance the appeal of Arab nationalism. It's kind of a way to push back on these centralizing reforms that also promote the Turkish language. So as we come closer to the First World War, we're actually going to see the formation of a number of political organizations, kind of promoting Arab nationalism, though to be clear, they're not calling for breaking away from the Ottoman Empire. Just for a certain degree of decentralization, kind of a more semi-autonomous status for the Arab people, at the very minimum that the Arabs should have a prominent place within the Ottoman structure. So three really important organizations that emerge during this period right before the First World War. You have the Ottoman Decentralization Party, and I think the name pretty much says it all. This is founded in 1912 by Syrians who are living in exile in Cairo, now under British control. Over there, the Ottoman government can't harass them if they're, promoting ideas or printing materials that they find objectionable. And they're not calling for, Arab independence, just seeking greater local autonomy against the centralizing trends of the CUP, the Committee of Union and Progress, which now is the governing organization within the Ottoman Empire. And then you have Al-Fatah, in some ways maybe the most important one. Certainly probably the one with the largest membership. It is a secret society of mostly Muslim Arab students who are studying in European universities, right? So many of them are abroad, meaning also that they're beyond the clutches of the Ottoman government if they have an issue with anything they're promoting. And again, they're not calling for Arab independence, just demanding greater equality, that Arabs should be on the same level administratively, politically, linguistically as Turks, and also demanding greater cultural autonomy for Arabs. And then finally you have Al-Ahad, which means covenant, a secret society of Arab officers in the Ottoman army. And again, not calling for independence. What they propose is turning the Ottoman Empire into a dual Turco-Arab monarchy, basically borrowing an idea from the Austrian Empire, which had by this time become the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, or even just Austria-Hungary, right? Wherein the Hungarian people, much as the Arabs are demanding now, had demanded kind of an equal status with their Austrian counterparts. Now, I mentioned in the meantime, we're going to see the development of a what we might call a Muslim strain of Arab nationalism or national identity. And in order to understand how that comes about and what it consists of, we actually should go back a little further to a fellow named Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. So he's not an Arab nationalist. He's not even Arab by any definition. He's Iranian, but Sunni. And that is part of the reason why he actually takes on the name al-Afghani, in a sense to throw people off his scent. His thinking being that if people know he's from Iran, they might assume that he's Shiite. So the name implies that he's actually from Afghanistan. Eventually, he actually has to go into exile from Iran. He's kind of involved in an assassination plot directed at the Shah. That kind of thing usually doesn't go over too well with the government. In any event, eventually he lands in Cairo, where he develops a following. And he promotes a movement called Asabiyyah, right? He believes that the main problem confronting the Muslim world in the sense that they're very quickly becoming dominated by Europe politically, certainly economically, socially, ideologically, in a host of ways. In many cases, coming under direct European control. He feels the main problem why they haven't been able to, really resist in a meaningful way is a lack of unity among Muslims, and he feels that Islam could form the basis of a political solidarity, which is kind of what asabiyyah means. That would bring Muslims together, and by doing that, they would better be able to resist European domination. Now, to be clear, for him, Islam is simply a means to an end, right? He feels that in order for Islam to serve this purpose, it needs to be purified, right? We need to get back to basics, and that would provide a foundation for, kind of reforming Islam, that it might provide a basis for political solidarity, right? But to be clear, means to an end. Many historians who have studied his works, pretty much convinced that if someone had convinced him that, say, Arab nationalism would be a more effective basis of achieving this political solidarity, he would have gone with that in a heartbeat, right? So, asabiyyah, by the way, if this comes up on the exam, let's be clear, this has nothing to do with the asabiyyah of Ibn Khaldun, a medieval Muslim historian. So if I see that on the exam, that's a pretty clear indication you're Googling for this, has nothing to do with what we're talking about here, and you're off by over 500 years right there, right? So please don't Google this stuff. Well, in any event, right, this he's going to have some followers in Cairo, and this idea of asabiyyah will actually come into play with the Urabi revolt. One of his disciples, a fellow named Abdallah al-Nadim, is actually going to use this idea of Islamic political solidarity as a basis for inciting the Egyptian population during the Urabi rebellion against the British. Now, here's something else to really keep in mind. When we're talking about Islam in this context, we mean it more as a kind of civilizational force, right? Kind of this religion that defined a whole new civilization, which actually includes non-Muslims, right? So really kind of broadening our definition of Islam in a way that it really, encompasses a civilization, not a, narrowly defined set of beliefs and practices, and therefore is inclusive of non-Muslims, individuals who share many of the same values, civilizational values, who are part of that civilization. And this is how al-Nadim really presents asabiyyah, right? As, for instance, inclusive of Egyptian Christians and Jews. And that is a very important distinction to be aware of when we now move on to the development of this kind of Arab nationalism that is somehow tied to Islam. And that brings us to another disciple of al-Afghani, Muhammad Abduh, who, by the way, we mentioned briefly in connection with Egyptian nationalism. But his thing is, he's really all about reforming Islam. But unlike al-Afghani, it is not a means to an end. This is, in fact, the end goal, a reformed Islam that would provide a basis for the Muslim world to modernize and progress. Right, rather than imitating Europe, right, we should look to our own civilizational values, our own way of life, and use that as a foundation for moving forward, right? And so he's going to develop a movement called salafiyyah. And by the way, he's going to fall out with al-Afghani because he kind of takes issue with this idea that Islam is only there to serve some other objective, right? For him, Islam is the main thing. Now, Salafiyyah means return to the way of the ancestors. And by the way, his disciple, Muhammad Rashid Rida, is going to be a big part of, kind of developing this ideology, right? So I want to look at Salafiyyah a bit more closely because it's a term that can very easily be misunderstood. So Salafiyyah literally means a return to the way of the ancestors, right? And that's, kind of pretty broad way of defining this movement. You could imagine it could mean many different things, and in fact, other organizations, other movements will also refer to themselves as Salafi movements, right? Even until today. So very often, if you hear the term Salafi, which is kind of adjective describing a movement that engages in Salafiyyah, or supports that, probably they're referring to Islamic fundamentalist groups more akin to, say, Al-Qaeda or ISIS or the Taliban in Afghanistan. That is not what Muhammad Abduh and his disciple Muhammad Rashid Rida are promoting, right? When they say getting back, to the Islam of Muhammad, to a pure Islam, they're really talking about broader principles that would provide a foundation for moving forward. They don't mean getting back to the Islam of Muhammad in a very literal sense. The main point here, and this is one theme that is really going to be developed by Muhammad Rashid Rida, is that a pure Islam is the Islam of the Arabs. The Arabs represented the Islam practiced by Muhammad and his immediate successors, right? And this is why, as long as the Arabs were politically in charge of the Islamic world, things had been great. Everything had gone south when other peoples had entered the region, became kind of the political elite. So the Islam of the Arabs could be distinguished from later Islamic practice, which had been corrupted by these people. And primarily they had the Turks in mind, right? Turkic people who had entered the region beginning around the late 10th, 11th centuries, and of course, eventually establishing various empires, among which was the Ottoman Empire, right? So, related to this, the Arabs have a special mission, right? The Arab community in this context is distinguished as something apart from other people on religious grounds. They have a special place with respect to Islam. They have a special mission, a special purpose to reform Islam. To be sure, to the benefit of all Muslims, right? But they were the ones who represented this pure Islam that could provide a basis, right, for developing principles that would allow the Islamic world to progress, to modernize, on their own terms, without having to imitate Europe, jettisoning their own way of life, westernizing, right? In some ways, then, within this context, the Arab nation becomes an extension of the religious community of believers, or ummah. And so this ends up laying the foundations for a different conception of Arab national identity, one very much rooted in Islam. Islam, in many ways, the thing that defines the Arabs as a people. But again, really stressing Islam understood in a much broader way than simply constituting a set of specific beliefs and practices, and therefore inclusive of non-Muslims. And so, by the way, for up until the First World War, whether we're talking about the more secular conception of Arab national identity coming out of the Protestant missionary schools, or what I like to call the Salafi model of Arab national identity, still limited appeal. But then we're going to hit the First World War, which, with respect to Arab nationalism, I like to call a tale of three documents, right? So first of all, I'm just, kind of briefly summarizing, the First World War is pretty much going to bring the Ottoman Empire to an end. So that kind of opens the door to other possibilities in terms of how to organize yourself politically and certainly nationalistically. Right. So also there are some things that Ottoman authority figures, whether political or military, are going to do that are going to really kind of push the Arab people away, meaning that they're going to become much more open to Arab nationalist kind of ideology. Right. But if we're really trying to understand kind of political developments related to Arab nationalism during the First World War, there are three documents in particular that you really need to become familiar with. And if you fully appreciate kind of the roles that they play during the First World War, you'll have a pretty good understanding of why things turned out the way they did, right? And those three documents are the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and the Balfour Declaration. So looking at each in turn, first of all, just to give a little context here, right? The Ottoman Empire will enter the First World War almost immediately after it starts on the side of the Central Powers, i.e. Germany, Austria-Hungary, meaning that they are now at war with the Allies, which are Great Britain, France, and Russia. And why did they decide to enter the war and to enter on the side of Germany? Probably the simplest explanation would be the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? They have issues with the Russian Empire, whom they're often at war with the British, who have occupied Egypt, and with the French, who are also, like the British, very active within the Ottoman Empire, right? So from the British point of view, what that means is, they're also at war with the Ottoman Empire, and anything they can do to weaken the Ottoman Empire would be, positive from their point of view. And at some point, they do become aware that there are hints of some kind of Arab nationalist movement developing in the Ottoman Empire, especially in Syria. The question then becomes, how much support does it actually enjoy? And if it does, is there anyone we could speak to who represents that movement writ large, right? And in fact, support for Arab nationalism is growing. Some of this reflects the harsh rule of the Ottoman governor in Syria, Jamal Pasha, who is actively seeking out anyone he suspects of supporting Arab nationalism. It's one of those self-fulfilling prophecies kind of things, right, where you go after people, they have public executions, rounding up people. And so a lot of Arabs who maybe didn't support Arab nationalism until that point are now going to be firmly in the Arab nationalist camp, right? So the British at some point have some awareness that there is some potential here. And what they're starting to formulate is this idea that if we can get the Arabs to rise up and revolt against the Ottoman Empire, this would help our cause, right, in trying to defeat the Ottoman Empire. The question is who to talk to, and at some point they're going to settle on the Sharif and Emir of Mecca, Hussein bin Ali, right? So first of all, the term Sharif, an honorific, kind of indicative of the fact that Hussein is a member of the Hashemite clan to which Muhammad belonged. He is the prince or emir of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest sites in Islam under Ottoman authority. It is actually an Ottoman government position, but he's a very ambitious individual, and as it turns out, is in contact with Arab nationalists in Syria. And so for a while, he's going to hold his cards very close to the vest, as they say. But at some point, there is an indication that he would be willing to support an Arab revolt. At some point, there is a determination that, in fact, he is in contact with Arab nationalists. So at some point that he does kind of represent them. So if you're making a deal with him, it actually carries weight. And so we're going to see the beginnings of a correspondence, a series of letters going back and forth between the Sharif Hussein and an individual who represents British authority based in Sudan, but who is speaking on behalf of the British government. And his name is Sir Henry McMahon. So that is the essence of the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. And so at some point, to put in simple terms, they are negotiating an Arab revolt, right? The idea that the Arabs will rise up in revolt, right, aiding the British war effort against the Ottoman Empire. And in return, the British indicate a willingness to support Arab independence in newly liberated Arab territories, right? And, with the help of the British Army. That at some point will march north from Egypt into Palestine and then eventually up into Syria, in theory, with the support of the Arabs, who will form militias of a much more informal nature, but will aid the British war effort. The main thing you need to know about the Hussein-McMahon correspondence is that at some point they're going to get bogged down over exactly which territories the British are prepared to recognize as part of an independent Arab state or confederacy of states. And many territories they agree upon. But at some point, they really get stuck on territory roughly corresponding to present-day Lebanon. Though, as expressed in the correspondence, the British basically indicate that they are not prepared to recognize Arab, as part of an independent Arab state, and I quote now, portions lying to the west of the districts of Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo, which they claim cannot be said to be purely Arab and should be excluded from the limits demanded. In the end, they agree to disagree in order to get the revolt going. So why are the British unwilling to consider what will eventually become Lebanon? Because of French interest there, right? Corresponding to the Maronite Christian community there. But here's the funny part, right? Later on, the British are going to claim that they also meant to exclude Palestine, which on that map, and I only put that map there because you can see Aleppo, Hama, Homs, and Damascus, what corresponds to Israel on that map, right? And that will become relevant with respect to our third document, the Balfour Declaration. But basically, the British are really stretching the definition of district by saying they also meant to exclude Palestine. Again, what on that map is indicated as Israel. First of all, with respect to the Ottoman administration, there are no districts corresponding to Damascus, Homs, Hama, and Aleppo. Second of all, there's kind of a question about, the term in Arabic that they're now translating to mean district is somehow extending far enough south to exclude Palestine. And third of all, to be quite sure, once the Arab revolt is underway and as the British army alongside the Arab militias move north, when they try to convince Arabs that they encounter in Palestine to join the revolt, they pretty much make it clear that they would be fighting for their own independence, not that they would be fighting in connection with what's being promised in the Balfour Declaration, which we'll get to momentarily, right? So that will become a major issue after the First World War at the Paris Peace Conference. Well, in any event, again, at some point they agree to disagree. The Arab revolt gets underway on June 5th, 1916. There will be a number of British military officers fighting alongside these Arab militias, one of whom becomes very famous, a fellow named T.E. Lawrence, who you see in the photo there. The subject of many popular films, probably the most famous of which is Lawrence of Arabia, which if you get a chance to see it, you definitely should. It's not entirely historically inaccurate, but it does, kind of consolidate a number of different characters into a smaller number, I think just for the sake of keeping the storyline relatively streamlined, right? But let's just say kind of the main points, as far as the actual history goes, they don't mess around too much with that. In any event, that brings us to our second document, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. So even as the Arab revolt is getting underway, the British and French are secretly negotiating on how to divide up the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire after the war, right? France represented by Picot, Great Britain represented by Sykes. To be clear, this is, they're both negotiating on behalf of their respective governments, so this will represent official British and French policy. And so, basically, once the Ottoman Empire entered the war, it was considered that the likelihood is it wouldn't survive. But in order to avoid conflict after the war, the idea was, why don't we negotiate over who's going to get which piece of the pie in advance, right? So, this would avoid any kind of balance of power issues. By the way, Sykes-Picot already taking into account, as of this moment, Russian interests in Istanbul or Constantinople, right? So that's already been agreed that they would get that. Very little consideration of what people on the ground might actually want. But in any event, right, both the British and French had interests in the Arab territories. And, you see there on the left a kind of a key passage from the agreement. But the essence of it is this, right? The blue zones would be under French control, dark blue, direct French control, light blue. Arabs would be semi-independent, but something along the lines of what we saw happen in Egypt, right, with the 4 reserve points. Same deal with the red zone vis-a-vis the British, right? Dark red under direct control, the kind of light red or pinkish color, autonomous / independent status. And most of what constitutes Palestine, Jerusalem, and the surrounding environs would be an international zone in recognition of its religious significance to too many different religions, right, including different sects of Christianity. It's such that the French would never countenance it being under Russian control, or the Russians would allow that it should be under French control, neither accepting British control. And then, of course, many Jews and Muslims would not be happy about that either. So here's the thing, right? This is a secret agreement. I think, to most rational individuals, it definitely goes against what the British had promised the Arabs in Hussein McMahon. There's some historical debate about whether at some point the British did make some of the Arab leaders of the revolt privy to this document. But certainly most Arabs who were fighting in the revolt had no knowledge of it and would not until after the Bolshevik Revolution, it was actually published, right? The Bolsheviks found it in the archives, inasmuch as the Imperial Russian government had a copy of it, and published it with the intent of embarrassing the British and the French. And certainly it did have that effect. Most Arabs would be outraged by, this feeling of betrayal, right? That the British, on the one hand, negotiating recognition of an independent Arab state in return for, Arab assistance in their war effort against the Ottoman Empire, but then at the same time secretly negotiating with the French about how to divide up Arab territory. And finally, that brings us to our third document, the Balfour Declaration. So, the British are definitely on a roll. They're negotiating with the Arabs, they're negotiating with the French, and they are negotiating with the World Zionist Organization, representing the movement of Zionism, which the simplest definition is that it represents Jewish nationalism. The idea that the Jews are, in a nationalistic sense, a people. I want to be clear, Zionism, by this point, highly organized, in large part because of the efforts by a fellow named Theodor Herzl. But it's definitely a very secular movement. It's not emphasizing religion. The Bible is, in this sense, kind of recontextualized as a pseudo-historical document, the history of the Jewish people. And related to that, probably their ultimate ambition is to create a Jewish state in the quote-unquote Holy Land, what they call Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, i.e. as in the people descended from Israel, and which at that time is simply known as Palestine, and by the way, would have included what today is Jordan. So they had been looking for, shall we say, a great power sponsor, and the British offered themselves in this vein. And there's like a whole, debate among historians about why the British came out so strongly in favor of Zionism, particularly with respect to Palestine. There are a number of reasons that have been offered. Some of it has to do with kind of conspiratorial thinking at the time that the Jews wielded undue influence both in the Russian and American governments, and thus might influence, after the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, to get Russia back into the war, in the case of the United States, to get it in for the first time. There is no historical evidence to back up the idea that Jews somehow had that kind of influence or that they actually were a factor. In any event, Russia is never going to come back into the war. The United States came into it for completely different reasons. Some of it also reflected, to be honest, a genuine sympathy, right, for the idea that, Jews have suffered centuries of anti-Semitism. In the end, they can never really be fully accepted or assimilated into other nations, right? Really, the only solution was for them to have their own state. That was probably the overriding argument made by the World Zionist Organization and Theodor Herzl. In fact, he had initially himself been a supporter of assimilation, but at some point had considered this unlikely to happen. And then finally, support of some kind of Jewish entity in Palestine, and they're going to be very vague about what they're calling for here, would provide a basis for the British to maintain a military presence in Palestine, right? And it's kind of important to realize that whatever had been settled on, kind of this idea of an international zone with Sykes-Picot, by 1917, when the Balfour Declaration is being formulated, the British are in fact militarily in control of Palestine. Their armies had been marching north with the help of the Arab militias and had taken control of Jerusalem in 1917 and then kept marching north. Right, so this would, in a sense, provide a justification for the British to maintain a presence there. That might be valuable as a kind of buffer zone protecting the Suez Canal, and so forth and so on, right? So what is it that they negotiated? Well, what you have here is, in fact, the entire text of the Balfour Declaration, right, issued by Arthur Balfour, head of the Foreign Office. But it's not, it's not just reflecting his personal opinion. It represents British policy. And it's addressed to a British representative of the World Zionist Organization. a fellow named Rothschild. In any event, what does it say? His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country, right? So I just want to highlight a few passages. First of all, what they're promising is not a Jewish state in Palestine or in part of Palestine. What they're promising is a national home. That is intentionally vague language. In fact, the declaration went through numerous drafts. At some point, they did consider saying state. National home, nicely vague, right? If you're speaking to a gung-ho supporter of Zionism, you can say, yes, this eventually, we're talking about a Jewish state. If you're talking to a Palestinian Arab, and as you might imagine, many of the indigenous Arab population are going to take grave issue with this, and in fact have been opposed to Zionism for some time up until this point. There had been kind of Zionist settlers, settling in Palestine for the last few decades, though at this point the Jewish population is only 10% of the overall population. But if they're nervous, you could say, "Listen, relax. We didn't promise them a state and national home," and they would probably be like, "Well, what is that?" It could be, just some kind of official political status in Palestine or recognition that Jews have certain rights. So that is why the language is intentionally vague, right? The other thing to highlight is the passage where it says, "Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities." That is, if you're a Palestinian Arab, you're kind of like, what do you mean we are the non-Jewish communities of Palestine? We are the Palestinian Arab community of Palestine, right? Notably also, nothing is mentioned about their political rights, only civil and religious rights. So the document refuses even to acknowledge that Palestinian Arabs are a people. And all of this is by intent, right? Documents like this, the wording is thought about very carefully, right? This isn't just, they didn't think about it clearly. There is an intention behind this. And this document, obviously, for most Arabs, is definitely going against what was promised in Hussein McMahon. But this is exactly where the British are at some point going to respond, remember we said we wouldn't include these territories to the west of the districts of Homs, Hama, Aleppo, and Damascus. We meant Palestine too. And most Palestinian Arabs are going to be, that is news to us, and that seems like a really kind of legalese, technical interpretation of what had been discussed. So this is going to be in some ways, you could say, kind of marking the beginning of what will become the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, albeit there is no Israel yet. Well, eventually the United States did enter the war. And the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, in an effort to justify why the United States is getting involved, first and foremost to the American people, came up with what are known as the 14 points, which would provide, according to him, a basis for a new international order in order to prevent a conflict like this from ever happening again. Right? So the United States, in theory, getting involved to create a better world. And, it's around this time you start to see propaganda posters about how the war is, fighting for democracy, making the world safe for democracy, a lot of democracy posters. This is definitely not how the war started. And the idea that this is what, the war was actually about, something introduced very late. Nonetheless, these 14 points will end up having a tremendous amount of influence at the Paris Peace Conference, if for no other reason than it really will sway the imagination of many Europeans who's like, thank God we were fighting for something, and definitely for many colonized people, right, who are going to assert their right to political and national self-determination on the basis of these 14 points. So I wanted to highlight here at least two of the points that I think are relevant to developments in the Middle East. The first, open covenants of peace, openly arrived at, after which there shall be no private international understandings of any kind, but diplomacy shall proceed always frankly and in the public view. Basically, what they're saying here is, treaties negotiated in secret about how to divide up territories, particularly where the people living there haven't been consulted, are not legitimate. I.e., Sykes-Picot is not legitimate, right? That kind of diplomacy has to take place in the open. They're also talking about these kind of defensive alliances that were kind of a major factor leading up to the First World War. But with respect to the Middle East, right, definitely Sykes-Picot not legitimate. Point number 5, a free, open-minded, and absolutely impartial adjustment of all colonial claims based upon a strict observance of the principle that in determining all such questions of sovereignty, the interests of the populations concerned must have equal weight with the equitable claims of the government whose title is to be determined. Well, let's see if we can streamline that a bit. Basically, if a European state is going to impose its political control over a territory, the viewpoint of the people living there has to be taken into account. In short, really what we're talking about here is the principle of national self-determination. Different peoples have the right to determine their own political future. If they want to be colonized by the British or French, great, that's fine, but you can't do it against their will. And as we already talked with respect to the Waft, the delegation representing Egypt's desire to become independent, right? This will become the basis of many colonial peoples' claim to break free of their colonial overlords. And that will also include the Arabs. So, eventually we have a peace conference in Paris. Again, we already referred to this in connection with developments in Egypt. And you have the great powers represented there, the British by their Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, the French by George Clemenceau, but also delegations representing various colonized people and Zionism. So representing Zionism, Chaim Weizmann, and they're going to argue their case also on the principle of national self-determination, that the Jewish people have the right to determine their own political future. And of course, a key component of that argument is that they need a state and that it should, for some reason, be in Palestine. Most often the argument being that given the biblical history of the Jewish people, this is in fact their homeland. And then finally, we have an Arab delegation headed up by one of the important leaders of the Arab revolt, Faisal, who was the son of the Hussein McMahon correspondence. By the way, part of his delegation will include T.E. Lawrence, who is there in theory as a translator, but really to provide advice about how to navigate European international politics. Well, Woodrow Wilson is going to be there too, representing the United States. And very quickly, you're going to see a division emerge between, on the one hand, the United States promoting this principle of national self-determination. By the way, to some extent, because it's perceived as being an American interest, if you get the British and French out of the Middle East, other parts of the world, that would open up their markets to American businesses. And then on the other side, you have the British and French who are, being a bit old school about this. We won the war, to the victors go the spoils, including colonies, territories. And they're going to demand, in essence, even though Sykes-Picot, technically illegitimate, negotiated in secret, does pretty much define what the British and French want, right, and what they're striving for at the Paris Peace Conference. At some point, Woodrow Wilson is going to propose that they put together an international commission to go to the Middle East, to the Arab territories there, and some other territories as well of the now somewhat defunct Ottoman Empire. It's still kind of there, but actually even smaller than the modern state of Turkey, and find out what the people there want. And the British and French are very, very reluctant to do this. In the end, they decide they don't want to take part in this. You do end up with an international commission, but it's actually made up entirely of Americans, and it goes by the name King-Crane Commission because the leaders of the commission are two guys named King and Crane, right? But it is, in a sense, representing the international community. It's an official investigation. It goes to the Middle East in 1919, and again, the basic purpose to find out what the indigenous inhabitants of the former Ottoman Empire actually want with regard to their political future. So what do they find? First of all, with respect to the Arab territories, the commission found that the local people want complete independence under Faisal, right? Faisal, who is representing the Arabs at the Paris Peace Conference, kind of a hero of the Arab revolt and so forth. They've even already set up a provisional independent Arab government in Damascus under him, kind of proposing he might be king, but, be a kind of constitutional monarchy. That is, if they get their way, that is, what they would prefer. Right? If they can't have that, if there should be some degree of foreign control, their preference is it should come from the Americans. Largely because until this point, the United States has had very little kind of imperial involvement in the Middle East. After that, they would prefer the British, who actually by this point have militarily occupied the region. Under no circumstances do they want the French. And at this point, what we're talking about, what has been proposed is kind of a compromise between outright colonialism, right, outright British and French control, and something between that and outright independence, right? The idea that these territories would be temporarily put under European control, but the European powers involved would have an obligation to prepare them for eventual independence, right? And so in connection with that, they're like, we kind of trust the Americans, maybe trust the British, and they're kind of already here, but at least they did make some kinds of promises in Hussein McMahon, might be able to use that as leverage, but we don't want the French. And you might remember with Sykes-Picot, the French had indicated a very strong interest in roughly what corresponds to Syria and Lebanon today. And then finally, they made it clear, we know all about Zionism. We quite understand what's going on there. We know what Zionist ambitions are for Palestine, and we are utterly opposed. We do not accept any of the terms of the Balfour Declaration. Jews who are already here, we would consider them if they're equal citizens of an Arab state, but not the idea of some kind of Jewish state being created in any part of Palestine. Well, in the end, what we're going to end up with is what's known as the mandatory system, right? Which affects not only the Middle East, but also many former colonies of Germany, which have now been taken away from Germany and put under the control of other powers, mostly European powers in the Pacific, under the control of Japan. And so the mandatory system, again, it's this kind of compromise position wherein whichever European power, or in the case of the Pacific, Japan, whoever is in charge, has in a sense ultimate authority, but has an obligation to prepare those people for eventual independence, right? So the argument being, and this very much this kind of Eurocentric point of view, that these people are not ready to govern themselves. We need to educate them in proper representative government. Here's the problem, right? So you might be thinking, well, that's not the ideal, but, it's a pretty good compromise. Eventually, they'll be independent. There are two problems here. First of all, there is no timetable stipulated. Each mandatory power, in the Middle East, we're talking about the British and French, will decide when the people under their control are actually ready to become independent. Second of all, it's never really clarified what independence means, and we might consider what happened in Egypt in this vein, or is about to happen, hasn't happened yet. The idea that, well, you're independent except we still maintain control of your foreign policy, your defensive policy, to some degree your army, maybe your oil resources, say in the future in the case of Iraq, and so forth, and so on. Right? So that will be a problem moving forward. But in any event, it is implemented, right? So on the right, you see the mandates that are created. The ones in yellow will be British mandates, right? Meaning the British have ultimate control over Iraq and Palestine. Later on, they will separate what is today Jordan from the rest of Palestine, and it will kind of go in its own direction. And Syria, inclusive of what will become Lebanon, and one of the first things the French are going to do is carve out an independent Lebanese state, will be under French control, right? So I should mention two last points, right? We have a newly created international body, the League of Nations. In theory, they have ultimate oversight over the mandates, But for the most part, they will defer to the British and French, as far as whatever progress is being made. Second of all, the mandate for Palestine will have a kind of special provision. The terms of the Balfour Declaration will actually be incorporated into the mandate for Palestine, meaning there the British have a dual obligation. On the one hand, to prepare the indigenous Arab population for eventual self-government, right? And on the other hand, to ensure the creation of a Jewish national home, which in practical terms will mean facilitating Jewish immigration to Palestine and the ability of Jews to purchase land there. And I think if you really ponder that for a moment, you'll realize that these two different obligations are mutually incompatible. Palestinian Arabs make it quite clear. If at any point they actually have real self-government, that will be an end of the terms related to the Balfour Declaration, right? And from the other side, a lot of Jews who are coming there, the ambition is eventually to convert Palestine into a Jewish state, what will become Israel, right? So you can see right there the foundations for the conflict between Israelis and the Arab world, more recently, really specifically between them and Palestinian Arabs, that is still with us today. So what about what was promised the Arabs by way of an independent Arab state? And this is what they end up with, right? So as far as what was promised in Hussein McMahon, I think it's quite easy to see why many Arabs felt betrayed by the British in terms of the outcome. British and French, we don't want to have any control over Mecca and Medina, and that's fine. But beyond that, there really isn't a lot here. This is before oil has been discovered. And by the way, the Hijaz, not an oil-rich region in any case. So a lot of disappointment. I should have mentioned, right, I forgot to mention with the preceding slide that the mandates that were created very much corresponding to what had been negotiated in the now viewed as illegitimate Sykes-Picot Agreement, right? So the British and French pretty much got what they wanted. Though the borders that are created by the mandatory powers, pretty much the borders we still have today. Should note those borders reflected more British and French imperial interests and any kind of natural divisions on the ground. So a lot of the conflicts we see racking the region today, this is where the foundation was laid for that, right? Kind of interesting to see how things play out. In some ways artificial divisions, but to some degree, many of the peoples in the region, did eventually come to see themselves as Syrian, Iraqi, Palestinian, and so forth. But in any event, that concludes our lecture, the second part of this lecture. And as usual, please make sure to respond to the lecture-based questions on Blackboard.